My parents tried to force me out of the family business, so I let their accountant speak. My name's Daniel, I'm 32, and I've basically grown up inside a dingy little office above my parents' HVAC shop. The joke in the family has always been that my first steps were between shelves of air filters, and honestly, that's not far from the truth. For as long as I can remember, the story was that one day the business would be mine, that all the long hours and missed weekends were an investment in my future. Yesterday was the first time it really hit me that my parents never meant that the way I heard it, and that they were fully prepared to shove me out the door as cheaply and quietly as possible. The day started pretty normal. It was one of those gray, sticky mornings here in Ohio, where the air feels like it's already been breathed a few times before it reaches you. I woke up around 6:30 to a text from my mom that just said, "Come to the office early. We need to talk about the future of the company." No smiley face, no extra words, just that. I stared at it for a good minute, that weird heavy feeling settling in my chest. We'd been arguing on and off for months about how things were being run, so talk about the future didn't exactly sound comforting. Still, I got up, made crappy drip coffee in the chipped mug I've had since college, and drove over with this knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. For context, my parents own a small HVAC company that does residential installs and maintenance. Nothing glamorous, just a couple trucks, a cramped warehouse, and a lot of old customers who know my dad by first name. I started helping when I was a kid, riding along on calls, holding flashlights, handing over tools. By the time I was 18, I was basically full-time without the title. I did install work for years, then moved into the office doing scheduling, quotes, and dealing with all the annoying paperwork my dad hates. A few years back, they started saying I was basically a partner, and that the business was my inheritance since I'm the only one of their 3 kids who stuck around. The thing is, nothing was ever written down in a way I fully understood. I trusted them because, well, they're my parents. Lately, though, things have been tense. My dad's burned out and has been talking about retiring more and more, and my mom keeps complaining about risk and liability and how they're tired of dealing with technicians calling in sick. I've been pushing for updates, new software, better website, online booking, stuff like that. Every time I suggested something, my dad would brush it off as too expensive or too complicated, and my mom would say we weren't a tech company. So there was this low-level frustration bubbling for a while. We weren't yelling every day, but there was this underlying feeling that we weren't on the same team anymore, especially when they started taking more vacations and I was still pulling 60-hour weeks. When I pulled into the lot that morning, I noticed my dad's truck and my mom's SUV parked straight and close like they had gotten there together and early. The metal door into the warehouse was still rolled halfway up, and I could smell that mix of dust, cardboard, and old coolant that I've known my whole life. But the office lights were already on, which was weird for that time. Usually I'm the one flipping on the fluorescent lights and listening to them flicker and buzz like they're deciding whether to work today or not. I walked in, and immediately I could tell something was off. My parents were both in the front office, dressed nicer than usual, and our accountant, Mark, was sitting in one of the visitor chairs with his leather briefcase at his feet. Mark is one of those quiet, middle-aged guys who always looks slightly uncomfortable in his own body, like he's apologizing for existing. He's been handling the books for as long as I can remember, coming in every few months to go over numbers with my parents. Usually when he's there, my dad jokes around, my mom makes coffee, and I'm half listening while answering calls. But this time, there was no joking, no coffee smell, just them sitting there with a stack of papers on the desk and 3 chairs arranged like they were staging some kind of presentation. My mom gave me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes, and my dad just nodded, his hands folded in this stiff way that made my stomach drop even more. I sat down in the chair across from them, the old vinyl squeaking under me, and my dad slid a manila envelope across the desk. It was the thick kind we usually use for contracts, but someone had written my full name across the front in blue ink, like something official or final. My fingers felt weirdly clumsy as I opened it. Inside was a stack of printed documents with the business name at the top, our LLC, and a title that made me freeze for a second: Member Interest Redemption and Release Agreement. I'm not a lawyer, but I've signed enough documents over the years to know that release is usually not something you want to skim. My dad started talking right away, using this fake calm voice I usually only hear when he's trying to upsell a customer on a new system. He was saying things like how he and my mom had an opportunity to finally retire, how the timing was perfect, how they'd found the right buyer who would take care of the customers. The more he talked, the less I heard. I was scanning the pages, seeing phrases like irrevocably waives, releases any and all claims, and a clause that basically said I'd be walking away from any present or future ownership interest in exchange for a lump sum that honestly made me want to laugh. It was less than what I make in a year, and nowhere near what this business is worth. Here's the thing. A couple of years ago, after a really good season, they had me sign something that they called making it official that I was part owner. We were in the same office, and my dad opened a bottle of cheap champagne from the grocery store, and my mom hugged me and said, "Now it's really yours too." I remember my hand shaking a little when I signed, not from fear, but from feeling like I was finally being seen. I didn't fully understand all the language, but I remember the word member and 10% interest because I joked that I was finally worth something on paper. Mark was there that day too, watching quietly. At the time, I didn't ask for a copy. Later, it bothered me, and I emailed him asking if he could send over the paperwork for my files. He did, and I stuck the PDF in a random folder on my laptop and never thought much more about it. So as I sat there with this new stack of papers, my head started connecting dots. The buyout amount. The way my parents' eyes kept flicking to Mark, but he stayed silent, staring at some invisible point on the wall. The fact that they hadn't mentioned anything about my existing 10% stake, like it was some minor detail instead of the thing that defined my role in the company. My mom chimed in with that soft, guilt-laced tone she uses, saying how this was a good deal, and how most people my age would kill for a payout like this and a clean slate to go find my own path. It felt like I was being fired and adopted at the same time. I asked, as calmly as I could, why we were doing this now and why no one had talked to me about a sale before things were already decided. My dad immediately went defensive, saying that these things are complicated and that they didn't want to worry me until everything was lined up. My mom said they'd protected me from the stress. Meanwhile, there was a line in the document mentioning that the sale was scheduled to close in 2 days. 2 days. So, apparently, I was important enough to sign away claims they needed gone, but not important enough to be part of the actual conversation until they needed my signature on a dotted line. My chest was tight, and I felt this strange buzzing in my ears, like when you stand up too fast. While they were talking over each other, I looked at Mark. He still hadn't said a word. He was sitting there with his hands folded on his knee, thumb rubbing the edge of his wedding ring over and over, shoulders tense. For some reason, that small movement stood out to me more than anything my parents were saying. They were trying to fill the room with their justification, but he was just there, present. You know when someone looks like they're debating with themselves whether to step in or stay out of it? That was written all over his face. I realized in that moment that whatever was going on here, he definitely knew more than I did. And for the first time that morning, I felt something other than panic. I felt angry. I put the documents down and asked a simple question. Did my 10% ownership not matter in any of this? The room went weirdly quiet for a second. My dad's jaw tightened. My mom's eyes flicked to Mark so fast, it was almost comical, like she forgot I could see. Mark finally cleared his throat, this small sound that somehow cut through the tension more than if he'd shouted. He asked, very quietly, if I'd like him to explain how my membership interest interacted with the sale documents. My dad immediately cut in and said something like, "We already went over that with him. It's not necessary." But his voice was sharper now, less calm salesman and more cornered animal. And that's when I realized that if I was going to get the truth about what was being done to me in that room, it wasn't going to come from my parents. Mark shifted in his seat, and I could see his face getting slightly red, like he already regretted speaking up. My parents were both staring at him, silently pleading for him to drop it, but something must have snapped inside him because he reached down, opened his briefcase, and pulled out a thin binder. The kind he usually brings when he wants to walk someone through numbers line by line. He placed it on the desk and kept his hand on top of it like he was grounding himself. When he looked at me, he didn't even try to hide how uncomfortable he was. He asked again, in that same soft voice, if I wanted a clear explanation of what my stake in the company actually meant in this context. I nodded before my parents could say anything. My mom let out this quiet sigh that sounded like defeat, and my dad muttered something under his breath. That alone told me more than any document ever could. Mark opened the binder slowly, flipping through the tabs until he reached one labeled Operating Agreement. He slid a highlighted page toward me, and he tapped the section that outlined member rights. I watched his hand, how his finger hesitated for a second like he was thinking through the consequences. He explained, still gentle and careful with his words, that even a minority interest like mine had legal weight in the event of a sale, and that typically all members had to sign off on major decisions, especially when the sale involved dissolving the current structure or transferring ownership in a way that erased previous stakes. As he talked, my parents got quieter and quieter. My dad's foot was bouncing under the desk, something he only does when he knows he screwed up. My mom kept rubbing the side of her neck, which she does when she's stressed. Every small gesture in that room suddenly felt magnified, like all the truths they'd been hiding were bleeding through the cracks. The deeper Mark went, the clearer it became that this sale wasn't some impulsive plan they cooked up last week. This had been in the works for months, maybe longer. He explained that he'd raised concerns multiple times about my stake needing to be addressed early in the process, and that legally, my signature was not a formality. It was required. I felt my jaw clench as he spoke, not because he was revealing something dramatic, but because everything he said made perfect, painful sense. The low payout number, the rushed timeline, the sudden urgency to get me in the office before the deal closed. They had built this entire process around the hope that I would just sign what they put in front of me, quietly, without asking questions. Like I always had. The realization made my stomach twist. My dad finally snapped and said something like, "This is unnecessary. He doesn't need the whole lecture." But Mark stayed focused on me, not raising his voice, not reacting. He pointed out that if I signed the papers as written, I'd not only be giving up my current interest, but also waiving my right to challenge the valuation of the business. The valuation, he added carefully, was lower than the typical range for companies of our size and revenue. When he said that, my mom closed her eyes for a moment, like she was bracing for impact. It wasn't dramatic, just this quiet, telling moment that made my chest feel heavy. I thought about all the extra hours I'd put in recently, running the office alone during their trips, doing installs when our tech called in sick, trying to keep things together because I believed we were building towards something I'd eventually inherit. I sat back in my chair, feeling that strange buzzing in my ears again. My parents were watching me now, waiting. It hit me in a way that made my hands shake. They had gone this far. They had waited until the last moment, brought me in under the guise of talking about the future, and hoped the combination of pressure, confusion, and their parental authority would push me into signing away the only leverage I had. Not because they needed to trick me, because it was easier for them that way. The silence in the office grew thick, the kind that feels heavy on your skin, like humidity before a storm. The fluorescent lights above us flickered again, making that faint buzzing sound that always annoyed me. But today it felt like the only thing anchoring me in the room. I asked Mark one question. If I said no today, did that stop the sale? He didn't even glance at my parents before answering. He said yes. My signature was required to move forward with the agreement as written. I swear I heard my dad exhale sharply, like he'd been punched in the gut. My mom's eyes went wide for a second before she looked down at the papers, flipping them back into tidy stacks even though they were already perfectly organized. She started talking fast then, trying to spin the situation into something palatable, insisting they weren't cutting me out, that the payout was symbolic, that the real benefit was me being free to start my own path without the weight of the company. Every word felt more hollow than the last. Mark quietly closed the binder and rested his hands on it, looking at me with this apologetic expression that made my throat tighten. He wasn't choosing sides, not exactly. It was like he had reached the limit of how much silence he could carry without betraying himself. The whole morning felt surreal, like one of those bad dreams where you're trapped in a familiar place, but everyone's acting just a little bit off. I looked at my parents and suddenly felt like a stranger in the office I'd grown up in. The worn fabric on the chairs, the faded company calendar on the wall, the dent in the metal doorframe from when I slammed a dolly into it at 19, none of it felt like mine anymore. It felt like someone else's story that I'd been borrowing. Eventually, I told them I needed time to think. My dad opened his mouth to argue, but Mark stepped in, saying it was reasonable and legally appropriate. The word legally made my dad flinch. I stood up slowly, feeling the stiffness in my neck and shoulders from how tense I'd been. My mom tried to stand and hug me, but I stepped back without really thinking. It wasn't anger. It was more like I was afraid that if she touched me, I'd fall apart right there on the office carpet. I grabbed the envelope, slid the papers back inside, and walked out without looking back at them. The warehouse was colder than I expected as I passed through, the smell of metal and cardboard grounding me again. Outside, the air felt heavy but cleaner than inside. I sat in my truck for a long minute, feeling my heartbeat slow down from that intense, buzzing panic. I'd come in expecting another argument about scheduling or budgets, not a full-on ambush designed to push me out of the only place I'd ever really known. But sitting there, gripping the steering wheel, something shifted. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't clueless. They needed me more than I needed them in that moment. And thanks to Mark, who didn't even have to help me, I actually knew the truth instead of walking into a trap blind. The strangest part is that, even as everything fell apart, I felt a small spark of relief. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining the distance, the secrecy, the strange behavior over the past few months. It was real, and now I had a decision to make. As I drove home, the sun finally pushed through the clouds for the first time that morning, casting this pale, almost weak light over the road. It felt fitting somehow, like the kind of day where nothing looks quite right, but you can still see enough to keep going. I rolled down the window a few inches, letting the cool air hit my face. My phone buzzed a few times with texts, probably from my mom, but I didn't look. I needed space. I needed silence. By the time I pulled into my apartment's parking lot, I knew I wasn't going to sign anything. Not yet. Not without understanding every word. And definitely not on their timeline. I spent most of the afternoon pacing around my apartment with the envelope on the counter, rereading the same sentences over and over until the words blurred together. Every time I reached the section about irrevocably waiving all claims, my stomach tightened. The dishwasher was humming, the neighbor's kid was running up and down the hallway outside, and my phone kept lighting up with messages I didn't open. It was like the entire world was moving normally while mine had frozen in place. At one point, I sat on the kitchen floor with a bottle of water I'd barely touched, thinking about all those years in the business, driving beat-up vans in winter storms, crawling through attics in July heat, getting called in on holidays because my dad didn't want to pay overtime for someone else. I kept thinking, how did we end up here? I wanted to cry, but the exhaustion just sat heavy in my chest instead. Around 4, Mark texted me. Just a brief message asking if I had any questions about the documents and saying that he'd be in his office for another hour if I needed clarification. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, but it was more kindness than I'd gotten from my own parents all day. I stared at the message for a long minute before grabbing my keys and driving to his office. It's in a small strip mall between a dry cleaner and a nail salon. When I walked in, the place smelled faintly of old carpet and printer toner. His receptionist gave me a small, knowing smile and buzzed him. When he came out to greet me, he looked tired, like the day had weighed on him too. He gestured toward the conference room, and I followed him inside, feeling strangely like a kid sent to the principal's office. We sat at the cheap laminate table, the kind with edges that peel if you pick at them. He spread out a few documents, including the original membership paperwork I signed years ago. Seeing my signature there, my 25-year-old self believing he was being welcomed into a future, made my throat tighten. Mark talked me through everything slowly, without any legal jargon. He made it clear that the proposed payout wasn't remotely fair, that no appraiser he'd worked with would value our company that low, and that the language in the document essentially erased any leverage I had. He kept pausing every few minutes to make sure I understood and wasn't overwhelmed. The whole time, he looked almost guilty, like he blamed himself for not pushing my parents harder earlier in the process. At one point I asked him why he finally spoke up today. He hesitated, then said something like, because at a certain point, silence becomes participation. It wasn't dramatic or emotional, just honest in a way that hit me harder than I expected. He told me he'd watched the dynamic for years, how much I carried, how little recognition I got, and that he wasn't comfortable letting them force me into something that would hurt me long term. Hearing that from someone who had nothing to gain made the room feel heavier and safer at the same time. I nodded, not trusting myself to say much, and he handed me a folder with copies of everything, including sections highlighted that he suggested I review carefully before doing anything at all. Driving home from his office, the sun was starting to set, that hazy late afternoon light making everything look softer. My phone vibrated again, my parents this time, asking where I'd gone, saying we needed to wrap this up. But something inside me had shifted. For the first time all day, I felt grounded. Not calm exactly, but present. I pulled into my lot and sat in the car for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. The idea that my parents were trying to push me out hurt more deeply than I expected, but now that the reality was laid out, the shock was slowly turning into resolve. I wasn't going to let them bulldoze me just because it was easier for them. Back inside my apartment, the air felt stale, and I opened the windows even though it was chilly out. I sat at my dining table, spread out the papers like Mark had done, and started reading everything again, this time with clarity instead of panic. I underlined parts that didn't make sense, circled wording Mark had flagged, and kept a notebook next to me where I wrote questions. I wasn't planning to fight for the company necessarily. I wasn't even sure I still wanted it. But I wasn't going to be tricked out of what was legally mine. And weirdly, that realization gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in months. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was choosing. It was past 6 when I finally called my younger sister, Emily. She lives a few states away and isn't involved in the business, but we've always been close in that quiet sibling way where you don't talk every day but still get each other. When she answered, I told her everything. Every detail. She listened without interrupting, which is something she's always been good at. When I finished, she said she wasn't surprised. That hurt more than anything else. She said she'd noticed for years how Mom and Dad treated the business like their private kingdom and me like a loyal worker they didn't have to appreciate. She reminded me that my worth didn't come from the company or their validation. Her voice was steady, and something about hearing that from her settled me in a way nothing else had. After we hung up, I heated up leftover pizza I barely tasted, then sat on the couch scrolling mindlessly, trying to unwind. But the apartment felt too quiet, and every time my phone buzzed with another message from my mom, my chest tightened. Around 8, I got a text from an unknown number that turned out to be the potential buyer's assistant. It was short, saying they hoped for a smooth closing and that they were eager to finalize proceedings. That phrase, finalize proceedings, felt like someone pushing a hand into my back, telling me to move along. I blocked the number without replying. Something about strangers assuming I'd be compliant made me feel a strange, simmering determination. At around 9, after pacing around my apartment again, I made a decision. I wasn't going into the office tomorrow. I wasn't signing anything. And I wasn't going to let them corner me again. I drafted an email to my parents. Short, simple, clear. I told them I was reviewing the documents with counsel, that their timeline wasn't reasonable, and that all communication regarding the sale needed to be in writing from now on. I didn't have a lawyer yet, but the moment I typed the words with counsel, I felt something release inside me. I wasn't the kid in the office anymore. I was protecting myself. When I hit send, I exhaled so deeply my shoulders actually loosened. I sat back and let the stillness settle in. The day had taken everything out of me, but I'd come out with something I didn't expect. Clarity. Not about what I wanted long-term, but about what I wasn't willing to tolerate anymore. Even if this whole mess ended badly, I knew one thing for sure. I would never let myself be blindsided like that again. And no matter how the next few weeks played out, I'd already taken the first step away from the version of myself who trusted too blindly. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I set an alarm, but because my mind wouldn't let me stay asleep. The apartment was cold, and for a moment I just lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out if the heaviness in my chest was dread or determination. Maybe both. I checked my phone and saw a string of texts from my mom. First asking if I was coming in, then reminding me that delays could complicate everything, then shifting into guilt about family unity. I didn't respond. The silence felt like the only power I had in that moment, and I wasn't giving it up. I made coffee slowly, trying to calm my hands enough to not spill grounds everywhere. The smell of it filling my small kitchen grounded me more than I expected. Around mid-morning, I emailed a local business attorney whose name Mark had quietly written on a sticky note the day before. The guy responded in less than an hour and offered to hop on a call. When we spoke, he asked direct questions, didn't sugarcoat anything, and confirmed that what my parents attempted was, in his words, sloppy at best, coercive at worst. Hearing someone professional put it in plain language made the entire situation feel painfully real. He told me not to sign a single thing and asked me to forward all documents, which I did immediately. By noon, I felt a shift, a small one, but enough to straighten my spine. I wasn't lost anymore. I was preparing. Around 1 in the afternoon, my dad finally called. Not text, called. I watched the phone buzz on the counter for nearly a full minute before picking it up. His voice was tight, controlled in that way he uses when he's trying to sound reasonable, but is actually furious. He asked why I was involving a lawyer. I said I was protecting my interests. He didn't like that answer at all. He went on a long rant about how the sale was time-sensitive, how I was overreacting, how he and Mom had earned the right to retire without drama. I kept my voice calm, borderline flat, and repeated that I wasn't signing anything until everything was reviewed. He accused me of being ungrateful. That word hit harder than I expected. I ended the call before I said something I couldn't take back. The rest of the afternoon was this uneasy mix of quiet and tension. I tried to distract myself, cleaning, folding laundry, mindlessly scrolling through an online hardware catalog, but everything kept circling back to the same question. How long had they been planning this? Months? A year? How many times had Mom told me they didn't want to burden me, while actively plotting to cut me out? That thought simmered under my skin as I reheated leftover fries for lunch I barely tasted. It felt like I was replaying every moment of the last few years with new context, like someone had swapped the audio track in my memories to reveal what was actually going on beneath the surface. Around 4, Mark called. His voice was calm, but I could hear that hint of hesitation again, like he wasn't sure if he was crossing a line just by checking in. He said he hoped I didn't mind him reaching out, but he wanted to let me know he'd received an email from my parents earlier asking if they could revise the sale documents. The way he said revise made it clear that they were scrambling. He didn't share details, which I appreciated, but he did say something that stuck with me. You did the right thing stepping back yesterday. Hearing that from someone who had seen everything behind the scenes steadied me more than anything else that day. I thanked him, and he sounded relieved to hear I wasn't angry with him. By early evening, the sky was already dim, and the apartment felt colder than usual. My parents hadn't called again, but they'd sent a new email asking me to come talk face-to-face so we can clear the air. I didn't reply. Instead, I took a long walk around the block. The air smelled faintly of wet leaves, and a few houses were already putting up winter decorations. Ordinary stuff, but it made me feel less alone in my own head. I kept thinking about how different things might have gone if Mark hadn't spoken up. Without him, I probably would have signed those papers in confusion and pressure. That thought made my stomach twist. I paused near the corner store, hands shoved deep in my pockets, and just breathed for a minute. I felt bruised emotionally, but not broken. When I got home, I found a long email from my mom waiting for me. It was the kind of message she sends when she's trying to control the tone, soft, emotional, full of phrases like, "We love you," and doing what's best for everyone, but never actually acknowledging wrongdoing. She kept insisting the offer was fair, that they never intended to hurt me, and that I misunderstood the situation. Not once did she mention my 10% stake or the fact that they hid the sale from me until the last minute. The omission felt louder than anything she wrote. I closed the email without responding. Something inside me had shifted so completely that their usual mix of guilt and soft pressure no longer worked. By the time I sat down on the couch, it was past 7 and the apartment was dark except for the lamp near the window. I felt drained, like the last 48 hours had wrung me out and left only the essentials behind. I wasn't victorious, not yet, and I wasn't sure how the story would end. But I knew something important. They couldn't push me around anymore. Not like that. And whatever happened with the business, whether I fought for a buyout that reflected reality, or held on to my stake, or walked away entirely, I wouldn't be doing it from a place of fear or obligation. I'd be doing it on my own terms. When I finally headed to bed, I saw Mark's folder still sitting on the dining table. I paused, reached out, and rested my hand on it for a moment. It struck me that the person who had protected me yesterday wasn't family. It was the quiet accountant who'd watched from the sidelines for years. And that strangely brought me more peace than anything my parents had said. I shut off the lights and went to bed feeling something I hadn't felt since this all started. Steady. Not okay, not healed, but steady enough to move forward. The next day at noon, I finally agreed to meet with my parents. Not at the office, not on their turf, but at a quiet coffee shop near my apartment where the tables were crowded and no one could corner anyone without an audience. I chose the spot on purpose. If they were going to try anything, it wouldn't happen in a place where people could overhear. When I walked in, they were already there, sitting in a small booth near the window. My mom gave me a tight smile, the kind she uses when she's trying too hard to seem calm. My dad looked irritated before I even sat down. I ordered a tea I didn't really want, just to have something to hold. They didn't waste time. My dad launched straight into an explanation about how miscommunication had blown everything out of proportion and how the payout was merely a starting point. He said they were willing to revisit the numbers if I was willing to cooperate. The word cooperate made my jaw tighten. My mom nodded along, doing that shaky inhale she does when she's trying to seem fragile. She kept saying they wanted to retire peacefully, that they deserved it, that they weren't trying to discard me. Every sentence felt rehearsed, like they'd practiced it in the car on the way over. I listened calmly, letting them talk themselves in circles until they finally paused long enough to look at me, waiting for a reaction. I pulled out the folder Mark had given me. The moment my parents saw it, their faces changed. My dad's eyes darted around the room like he was checking who could hear us, and my mom actually swallowed hard. I laid out only the first page, the one highlighting my 10% ownership rights. I wasn't rude. I wasn't emotional. I simply said, this wasn't miscommunication. My voice was steady in a way it hadn't been at the office. My dad tried to interrupt, but I kept going. I told them I knew how long they'd been planning the sale, that they had intentionally left me out, and that the documents they presented violated both the operating agreement and my rights as a member of the LLC. I wasn't shouting. I wasn't angry. I was factual. Watching the color drain from my dad's face as he realized I actually knew what I was talking about was one of the strangest moments of my life. My mom shifted into guilt mode then, saying they only hid the sale because they didn't want to overwhelm me, that the payout was low because the market is tough, that involving a lawyer was unnecessary escalation. She reached across the table like she wanted to hold my hand, but I didn't move. She slowly pulled her hand back, her face falling just slightly. I told them I wasn't signing anything until everything had been properly evaluated and renegotiated with legal oversight. My dad tried to say that would complicate the sale, and I said, that's not my problem. It was the first time in my life I'd said something like that to him. Silence hit the table so fast it almost stunned me. For a long moment, the only sound was the espresso machine hissing behind the counter. My dad finally leaned back, exhaling sharply like he'd been beaten in an argument he never prepared for. He didn't apologize. My parents aren't the apologizing type, but something in him deflated. He said they'd figure things out, and that they didn't want to fight. My mom looked like she was on the verge of tears, not because they regretted what they'd done, but because they realized they couldn't steamroll me anymore. I didn't offer comfort. I just nodded once, stood up, and told them to email my attorney if they had anything further. I didn't wait for a response. I walked out into the cold air feeling shaky but oddly light. Outside, the sky was overcast, that pale winter gray that hangs low and still. I took a deep breath, my hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline. Even though the conversation had been uncomfortable, even painful, I felt something settle inside me, a quiet certainty that I'd finally stepped out of whatever role they'd boxed me into my whole life. As I walked back to my car, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Mark. If you need support navigating the next steps, let me know. I don't know why, but that text hit me harder emotionally than anything my parents had said. Someone who didn't know me anything was offering genuine support. Family by choice, not obligation. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I got into my car and sat there for a moment, watching the traffic crawl by on the road. My breath fogged the inside of the windshield. I realized I didn't feel anger anymore, just this strange, bittersweet mix of sadness and strength. The business might still sell. My parents might still try to lowball me. Nothing was magically fixed. But something inside me had changed permanently. I wasn't operating from fear or loyalty anymore. I was operating from self-respect. On the drive home, I felt that same weak winter sunlight slip through the clouds again, just like the day of the ambush meeting. It wasn't bright enough to warm anything, but it was enough to see by. And for the first time, the path ahead felt like mine. Not something handed to me, not something controlled by someone else, but something I could actually choose. I didn't know what would come next, but I finally understood something important. I didn't lose anything in this. I reclaimed something I should have had all along. And no matter how messy the next few weeks got, I'd walk into them with my head high and my eyes open.